How can we take a simple single cycle waveform such as this and use the filtering and effects available in Synthmaster 2 to make it a bit more interesting like this? So in part 3 of our series on Synthmaster 2, we will be taking a look at using the filters and effects to give us a more creative and interesting patch when we're working on designing our sounds. And let's just start with our basic waveform. And we'll first take a look at the filter parameters. Now, if you've watched the entire series, then you know that within Synthmaster 2, we have two separate layers that we can access by clicking here, and within each layer we have two different filters available to us. We can activate the filters by clicking on their corresponding buttons within our routing display here. So filter 1, just clicking once, we activate that. Filter 2, we can click to activate by clicking there. Now we can choose between three different filter structures, which we covered in part 1, so we won't spend too much time here. Just know that we can, by default, we start off in a series structure. So filter 1 is going to feed directly into filter 2 and then onto our effects that we've chosen. We can then choose split. So oscillator 1 is going to specifically be processed by filter 1. Oscillator 2 specifically by filter 2. They'll then be passed on to our effects. And then finally we have parallel. In this mode, both oscillator 1 and 2 will be processed by filter 1 and filter 2, but in a parallel fashion versus the default of series, one after the other. But again, we took a look at this in part 1, so let's come back to the default of series. Now for each of the 4 filters available in Synthmaster 2, we can choose from one of 6 different algorithms. Each will affect the character of our filter and sound. Also notice that each of the filter types that we have will have different options as far as the high pass, band pass, low pass. So if we come to the digital, then we can see everything that's available here. Comb is going to be unique to the digital, but you can see we have a lot of different options here: high pass, band pass, peak, dual, comb. If we were to choose the virtual analog, then we can see we have a variety of options here. We have multi and dual. So notice that when we change from multi to the dual mode, we have actually 2 different cutoffs that we can make use of for processing our sound, our resonance. We can take up for both by using that, and then blend between the two by using this knob here. So multiple different controls when we're making use of the dual mode in the virtual analog. Now, we also have ladder, just a handful here. Then we have our diode ladder, which only has low pass available. We then have our state variable filter, which also has a multi-mode. And then we have our byte, which has low pass and high pass options. But let's come back to our first, the digital. Now next we have a display for our cutoff and resonance settings, and then here we have a handle that we can use to make adjustments to cutoff and resonance at the same time. And of course this handle ties in with the cutoff and resonance down below. When we adjust here, then we just make changes to one at a time. Now, if we're working with the analog modeled filter, this does have the ability to self-oscillate actually. So just a quick note on that, but we'll come back to the digital. Let's double click to take our settings back to the default. Now next to our cutoff and resonance, we have familiar gain and key tracking controls, which is what you'll find on many features in virtual synthesizers. So our gain, let's take our cutoff up a bit. The gain is just going to increase or decrease the gain of our filter. Our key tracking is going to determine how much our higher frequencies are going to open up as we play higher on the keyboard. So by default, when I play a lower key, we don't hear many high frequencies, of course, partly because we're playing a lower key, but if I were to go ahead and play up higher, we can hear the higher frequencies come through, but if I were to take the key tracking down, then we can barely hear anything at all. If I were to take the cutoff down a bit further, then we really don't hear much at all. But if I take the key tracking up, that's going to allow some of those higher frequencies to come through as we move along and make our way up the range of the keyboard. Now, just as we saw that changing the different algorithm types is going to determine what the modes are that we have available to us here, different parameters are going to be available to us or not in our filter panel also, depending on the algorithm that we have chosen. Now, for instance, specific to our digital filter, it has a hard limiter built in internally after the filter stage. And this hard limiter is triggered by an envelope follower whose attack and decay times can be controlled by using the attack and decay parameters here. And again, these parameters are going to be specific to the digital. So if we were to come to the virtual analog, then we can see that those are replaced with pregain and drive. Coming to the ladder, we can see pregain and drive. Come back to our digital, we then have our attack and decay for the hard limiter. Now also within the digital filter, we have the ability to choose a slope, two different slopes, whether it's going to be 12 dB or 24. And as you can see with the 24 dB, we're going to have a more aggressive cut of our frequencies at wherever we set the cutoff at. Now the ability to choose the cutoff slope is also going to be available in the ladder settings. So we can see it's moved down towards the bottom of the panel here, but that is available within our ladder. So now for all of the other algorithms, we do not have the slope selection available to us. Now we also, to the right of our slope settings, have a boost button. And this parameter can be used to compensate for the gain drop when increasing our resonance. So if I take the resonance of this up, notice that the overall gain for our filter is going to be decreased. Let's actually take the gain up a little bit more. Okay, so but once we activate the boost, we can see that the overall level is going to be increased. Taking the resonance back down, now when I deactivate boost, there is no change in the level because our resonance is down. So this specifically works with higher settings of the resonance. Now the boost parameter is going to be available in most of the other algorithms except for the state variable. We don't have that. And the byte algorithm. But if you notice here, we do have this acid button, and this will add a TB303 style acid filter response. And so this is going to be available in many of the algorithms. Acid. And for each of the analog model filters, we also have a nonlinearity setting here. And this allows you to choose how close the modeling of the filter will be to analog gear, keeping in mind that this will affect CPU usage. We can choose between basic, normal, and high. Choosing high is of course going to give you the most realistic modeling, but will also tax your CPU more. But just be aware that you do have these options available to you if you're trying to get the most or the closest emulation to analog as possible. Now, as we saw, the digital filter has the attack decay processing for the built-in hard limiter. For the rest of the algorithms, you will find a pregain, drive, and distortion. And the distortion is available in the digital as well, but not the drive. Well, the drive is there as well. It's just that our distortion settings are moved up to the top here. Let's come back to the virtual analog. Okay, so our our pregain, drive. Now the distortion, when we click on this in the drop-down menu, the before filter and after filter are going to work in tandem with our curve up above here. So if I were to go ahead and choose before filter and then make some adjustments here, it does kind of click when I make the adjustments, so please excuse that. We can adjust the curve. Okay, so just be aware that the before filter and after filter specifically work with our curve settings here. Okay, now let's actually come to the gear icon and reset to the defaults. That's going to take everything back to as it was and deactivate the filter. So let's click again on filter 1. Also take note in the menu here, we can copy our settings and paste them into filter 2 or one of the other filters on layer 2. Then we would click on the gear and choose paste settings. We can lock the layer, the filter, save a preset, or load a preset. And we have some that are available. So if we were to choose this preset, let's activate the filter. And we'll give a listen to just one of the other ones. Activate the filter. That's pretty hot, so we could always come down to the layer 1 level and then take that down. Okay, again, we will reset to the defaults and activate the filter. Okay, so we've covered a lot of different parameters that are available within the filter panel, and I hope it's becoming apparent just how powerful and flexible the filter options are. We could spend even more time taking a look at different filter types and modes and just experimenting with the sounds, but in the name of time, let's move on and quickly apply some modulation to our filter to add a bit of movement. So I'm actually going to choose the virtual analog. Let's take this up just a little bit. Now, in order to apply modulation from a modulation source to a parameter, I'd like to use the cutoff. We can simply, let's choose the multi-stage envelope. I'm going to click, hold, and drag and release over the top of the cutoff, and that's now been assigned. We now have this orange border on the collar of the parameter, and you can see we have double arrows, so we could click, hold, and drag up or down to adjust the amount of modulation we'd like to apply to our cutoff. So as it is, it's a pretty boring setting, but I actually saved a preset for the multi-stage envelope for this tutorial. So I'll come to the gear icon at the bottom, load preset, tutorial 1. Let's then give this a listen. Okay, so we've got a little bit of movement, but the sound, the timbre is still a bit boring. So let's move on to take a look at how we can use the effects included in Synthmaster 2 to make this a bit more interesting and recreate what we heard at the beginning of the tutorial. Now keep in mind, we're still working with one oscillator and one voice per note. So here in our routing display, you can see that I have 4 different oscillators or 4 different effects loaded. Whenever we'd like to add an effect, we can right click on one of these fields, or right click and then select from the menu. We have 11, I believe, that we could choose from. So then I could add the lo-fi and that's activated, but I'm going to remove that out. Right click, choose the little bracket here, and that's been taken out. Okay, so now let's add these in by one, and you'll see just how easy it is to make this patch a lot more interesting. So we'll start with our distortion. Let's add the chorus. Some delay. And finally our reverb. Beautiful. Okay, so we've seen we could just right click to add different effects within our routing display here, but what if we'd like to further work with the parameters of these effects? So for instance, the distortion is a bit much for me. I'd like to take that down. We can come to the effects tab up above, and then we can see our distortion, and we have drive and mix controls. So let's deactivate the other effects. We could do that by clicking on the box. We could also click here in our layer effects routing. If we're on the layer 1 page, we can also, as we've seen, click once to activate and deactivate here. But we'll come back to our effects tab. So we can determine how much of the effect with the mix. And I felt like this is a bit much. We'll take the drive down and the mix down as well. We've got a curve that we can make use of, as well as pre and post EQ to determine how much of what frequency of the signal will be processed before or after this distortion effect. The pre will determine what frequencies are affected by the distortion, rather. We also have the familiar gear icon where we can make use of different presets. So if I choose organic, take the mix down just a little bit. Now let's activate our chorus. Again, we have mix control, how much of the effect we would like, its width, panning, feedback, speed, modulation. Now we could even sync the speed to our DAW, so once that's activated, we can click on the field here and choose a different resolution, whether it's quarter note or eighth notes. And this is going to be based on the tempo of our song. Left and right phase, delay. Okay, we'll power off the chorus and let's move on to the delay. Again, our mix control, the width, panning, feedback. We can add drive to the delayed signal. Let's take our feedback down. And the drive. Again, we can sync to our DAW's tempo, EQ control. Then finally we have reverb. I think that sounds really good. We can also choose from different presets, as we've seen throughout this tutorial, by coming to the gear icon. So let's choose something different here. Adjust the size. Our damping is going to control how much of the high frequency is going to be included in the reverb signal. So coming to the left, we remove a lot of those high frequencies out of the reverb signal or the process signal. We can modulate the process signal. by taking up the mod amount and the speed. So a lot of cool parameters for tweaking and coming up with just the right reverb that you're looking for your sound. Now, I think we've talked about the fact that we can have 5 different effects for each layer, but we also have 2 different buses, global effects buses, that we can route our layers to. So if we wanted to add some compression, for instance, to both layers, we can right-click on bus 1, choose the compressor, and then we can come to the layer sends, and our oscillator and effects are active on layer 1, so we can then send that to the compressor. We can control how much of the dry signal is going to head out to the master out here. If we had an oscillator active on bus 2, or I'm sorry, layer 2, we could then increase that and have that processed by our compressor as well. We can come to bus 2 and add effects here and send our layer 1 and layer 2 to it. But let's double click to return these back to the defaults. I'll right click and choose on the bracket to clear these out. And we'll just right click to take a look at some of the other effects that are available. So we have a ensemble. Let's power off the reverb, delay, and distortion. We could change the voices, delay, panning. Let's right click and select the lo-fi. We have our familiar mix. We can take the bits down if we'd like a grungy sound. Sample and hold. Our cutoff and resonance. Okay, let's right click, and what else we have? The equalizer. We're all familiar with equalizers. Right click. We have a vocoder. By default, this is going to be on audio input, so you need to have that set up. But if we right click on this field, we can choose from layer 1 dry, layer 1 effects, and so on. Okay, and what else have we got? We've got tremolo. The mix control is going to be all the way up. We've got our moderate, the left to right ratio, and we can sync to our DAW, of course. That's going to allow us to choose from this field. Let's just set this to quarter note. Phase. Tremolo is pretty straightforward. Let's right click. And I think we've pretty much covered everything here. I'm not sure if we covered the filter bank, but we do have a filter bank available to us. Lots of options here. We can come to the bottom, choose the filter type, adjust the cutoff and our gain with these controls up above. We also have boost and acid parameters, which we've seen previously. So as you can see, there are a lot of cool effects and a ton of experimentation that can be done within Synthmaster 2. I hope that you just spend hours tweaking, just bring in each effect and play around with all of the different parameters. I hope that this tutorial has given you a better idea of what the parameters will do, not only with the effects, but as well as what we've seen within the filter section as well. So we will conclude here part 3, and in part 4, our final video, we'll take a look at the arpeggiator sequencer panel here. We can expand that with the magnifying glass in the upper right hand corner, and we'll take a look at a couple other miscellaneous things, such as the scale settings here that we can make use of, which is very cool, and a few other things. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next tutorial.